Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God. Back with you with the next video in my series reading Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Without further ado, returning to Oliver Twist as read by Lord Naren White. You've been brought up bad, said the Dodger, surveying his boots with much satisfaction when Oliver had polished them. Fagin will make something of you, though, or you'll be the first he ever had that turned out unprofitable. You'd better begin at once, for you'll come to the trade long before you think of it. And you're only losing time, Oliver. Master Bates backed this advice and sundry moral admonitions of his own, which, being exhausted, he and his friend Mr. Dawkins launched into a glowing description of the numerous pleasures incidental to the life they led, interspersed with a variety of hints to Oliver that the best thing he could do would be to secure Fagin's favor without more delay by the means which they themselves had employed to gain it. And always, put this in your pipe, Nolly, said the Dodger, as the Jew was heard, unlocking the door above. If you don't take the fogels and tickers. What's the good of talking in that way? Interposed Master Bates. He don't know what you mean. If you don't take the pocket handkerchiefs and watches, said the Dodger, reducing his conversation to the level of Oliver's capacity, some other cove will, so that the coves that lose 'em will be all the worse, and you'll be all the worse too, and nobody half a ha'porth of a better, except the chaps what gets 'em, and you've just as good a right to them as they have. To be sure, said the Jew, who had entered unseen by Oliver. It all lies in a nutshell, my dear, in a nutshell. Take the Dodger's word for it. Ha, ha, ha. He understands the catechism of his trade. The old man rubbed his hands gleefully together as he corroborated the Dodger's reasoning in these terms, and chuckled with delight at his pupil's proficiency. The conversation proceeded no further at this time, for the Jew had returned home accompanied by Miss Betsy and a gentleman whom Oliver had never seen before, but who was accosted by the Dodger as Tom Chitling, and who, having lingered on the stairs to exchange a few gallantries with the lady, now made his appearance. Mr. Chitling was older in years than the Dodger, having perhaps numbered 18 winters, but there was a degree of deference in his deportment towards that young gentleman which seemed to indicate that he felt conscious of his slight inferiority in point of genius and professional acquirements. He had small, twinkling eyes and a pock-marked face, wore a fur cap, a dark corduroy jacket, greasy fustian trousers, and an apron. His wardrobe was, in truth, rather out of repair, but he excused himself to the company by stating that his time was only out an hour before, and that in consequence of having worn the regimentals for 6 weeks past, he had not been able to bestow any attention on his private clothes. Mr. Chitling added, with strong marks of irritation, that the new way of fumigating clothes up yonder was infernal unconstitutional, for it burnt holes in them, and there was no remedy against the county. The same remark he considered to apply to the regulation mode of cutting the hair, which he held to be decidedly unlawful. Mr. Chitling wound up his observations by stating that he had not touched a drop of anything for 42 moral, long, hard-working days, and that he wished he might be busted if he weren't as dry as a lime basket. Where do you think this gentleman has come from, Oliver? Inquired the Jew with a grin, as the other boys put a bottle of spirits on the table. I don't know, sir, replied Oliver. Who's that? Inquired Tom Chitling, casting a contemptuous look at Oliver. "A young friend of mine, my dear," replied the Jew. "He's in luck then," said the young man. Excuse me. "He's in luck then," said the young man, with a meaning look at Fagin. "Never mind where I came from, young'un. You'll find your way there, soon enough. I'll bet a crown." At this sally, the boys laughed. After some more jokes on the same subject, they exchanged a few short whispers with Fagin and withdrew. After some words apart between the last comer and Fagin, they drew their chairs towards the fire, and the Jew, telling Oliver to come and sit by him, led the conversation to the topics most calculated to interest his hearers. These were the great advantages of the trade, the proficiency of the Dodger, the amiability of Charlie Bates, and the liberality of the Jew himself. At length, these subjects displayed signs of being thoroughly exhausted, and Mr. Chitling did the same, for the house of correction becomes fatiguing after a week or two. Miss Betsy accordingly withdrew, and left the party to their repose. From this day Oliver was seldom left alone, but was placed in almost constant communication with the two boys, who played an old game with the Jew every day. Whether for their own improvement or Oliver's, Mr. Fagin best knew. At other times the old man would tell them stories of robberies he had committed in his younger days, mixed up with so much droll and curious that Oliver could not help laughing heartily, and showing that he was amused in spite of all his better feelings. In short, the wily old Jew had the boy in his toils, having prepared his mind by solitude and gloom to prefer any society and companionship to his own sad thoughts in such a dreary place. He was now slowly instilling into his soul the poison which he hoped would blacken it and change its hue forever. Chapter 19, in which a notable plan is discussed and determined on. It was a chill, damp, windy night when the Jew, buttoning his great coat tight round his shriveled body, and pulling the collar up over his ears so as completely to obscure the lower part of his face, emerged from his den. He paused on the step as the door was locked and chained behind him, and having listened while the boys made all secure, and until their retreating footsteps were no longer audible, slunk down the street as quickly as he could. The house to which Oliver had been conveyed was in the neighborhood of Whitechapel. The Jew stopped for an instant at the corner of the street and, glancing suspiciously round, crossed the road and struck off in the direction of the Spital Fields. The mud lay thick upon the stones, and a black mist hung over the streets. The rain fell sluggishly down, and everything felt cold and clammy to the touch. It seemed just the night when it befitted such a being as the Jew to be abroad. As he guided stealthily along, creeping beneath the shelter of the walls and doorways, the hideous man seemed like some loathsome reptile, engendered in the slime and darkness through which he moved, crawling forth by night, in search of some rich offal for a meal. He kept on his course through many winding and narrow ways until he reached Bethnal Green. Then, turning suddenly off to the left, he soon became involved in a maze of the mean and dirty streets which abound in that close and densely populated quarter. The Jew was evidently too familiar with the ground he traversed to be at all bewildered, either by the darkness of the night or the intricacies of the way. He hurried through several alleys and streets, and at length turned into one, lighted only by a single lamp at the farther end. At the door of a house in this street he knocked. Having exchanged a few muttered words with the person who opened it, he walked upstairs. A dog growled as he touched the handle of a room door, and a man's voice demanded who was there. "Only me, Bill. Only me, my dear," said the Jew, looking in. "Bring in your body, then," said Sikes. "Lie down, you stupid brute. Don't you know the devil when he's got a great coat on?" Apparently, the dog had been somewhat deceived by Mr. Fagin's outer garment, for as the Jew unbuttoned it and threw it over the back of a chair, he retired to the corner from which he had risen, wagging his tail as he went, to show that he was as well satisfied as it was in his nature to be. "Well," said Sikes. "Well, my dear," replied the Jew. "Ah, Nancy." The latter recognition was uttered with just enough embarrassment to imply a doubt of its reception, for Mr. Fagin and his young friend had not met since she had interfered in behalf of Oliver. All doubts upon the subject, if he had any, were speedily removed by the young lady's behavior. She took her feet off the fender, pushed back her chair, and bade Fagin draw up his, without saying more about it, for it was a cold night and no mistake. "It is cold, Nancy dear," said the Jew, as he warmed his skinny hands over the fire. "It seems to go right through one," added the old man, touching his side. "It must be a piercer if it finds its way through your heart," said Mr. Sikes. "Give him something to drink, Nancy. Burn my body, make haste. It's enough to turn a man ill to see his lean old carcase shivering in that way, just like a ugly ghost just rose from the grave." We'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.